Mr. Taylor drove us back to the Evergreens so we could wash up and rest, and promptly at 5:45 returned to drive us to the impressive cafeteria near the railroad station. We'd all meet up afterward, he said, to start the night tour of Washington postponed from the day before. "Why don't you come along tonight?" my father said to him. "It must get lonely eating by yourself all the time." "I wouldn't want to invade your privacy, Mr. Roth. Listen here, you're a wonderful guide and we would enjoy it. Treats on us." The cafeteria was even more popular at night than it was during the day. Every chair occupied and customers standing in line waiting to have their selections spooned out by the three men in white aprons and white caps who were so busy serving they didn't have time to stop and dry their perspiring faces. At our table, my mother took solace in resuming her motherly mealtime role. "Darling, try not to lower your chin to the plate when you take a bite." And having Mr. Taylor seated beside us as if he were a relative or a family friend, though not so novel an adventure as being thrown out of the Douglas Hotel, provided an opportunity to watch someone eat who'd grown up in Indiana. My father was the only one of us paying attention to the other diners, all of them laughing and smoking and diligently digging into the Frenchified evening special, roast beef au jus and pecan pie a la mode, while he sat there fingering his water glass, seemingly trying to figure out how the problems in their lives could be so unlike his own. When he got around to expressing his thoughts, which continued to take precedence over his eating, it wasn't to one of us, but to Mr. Taylor, who was just staring in on the piece of pie, topped with American cheese, that he'd chosen for dessert. "We are a Jewish family, Mr. Taylor. You know that by now, if you didn't already, because that's the reason we were evicted yesterday. That was a big shock," he said. "That's hard to get over just like that. It's a shock because though it's something that could have happened without this man being president, he is the president, and he is no friend of the Jews. He is a friend of Adolf Hitler." "Herman," my mother whispered, "you'll frighten the little one." "The little one knows everything already," he said, and resumed addressing Mr. Taylor. "You ever listen to Winchell? Let me quote you Walter Winchell. 'Was there any more to their diplomatic understanding, other things they talked about, other things they agreed on? Did they reach an understanding about America's Jews, and if so, what was it?' That's the kind of guts Winchell has. Those are the words he has the guts to speak to the entire country." Surprisingly, someone had stepped up so close to our table that he was hanging half over it, a heavy-set, mustached, elderly man with a white paper napkin jammed into his belt, who seemed inflamed with whatever he had in mind to say. He was eating at a nearby table, and his companions were all leaning our way, eager to hear what was coming next. "Hey, what are you doing, Bud?" my father said. "Back up, will you?" "Winchell is a Jew," the man announced, "in the pay of the British government." What happened next was that my father's hands rose violently from the table, as though to drive his knife and fork upward into the stranger's holiday goose of a belly. He hadn't to elaborate further to communicate his abhorrence, and yet the man with the mustache did not budge. The mustache wasn't a dark, close-clipped little patch like Hitler's, but one conceived of in a less officious, more whimsical spirit, a conspicuously substantial white walrus mustache of the type displayed by President Taft on the light red 1938 50-cent stamp. "If ever there was a case of a loudmouth Jew with too much power," the president said. "That's enough!" Mr. Taylor cried, and jumping to his feet placed himself, undersized as he was, between the large figure looming over us and my outraged father, pinned below us by all the ludicrous bulk. Loudmouth Jew for the second time in less than 48 hours. Two of the aproned men from behind the serving counter had rushed out onto the floor of the cafeteria and taken hold of our assailant, but from either side. "This is not your corner saloon," one of them told him, "and don't you forget it, mister." At his table they pushed him down into his chair, and then the one who'd chastised him came over to us and said, "I want you folks to fill your coffee cups as much as you like. Let me bring the boys some more ice cream. You folks just stay and finish up your supper. I am the owner, my name is Wilbur, and all the dessert you want is on the house. Let's bring you fresh ice water while we're at it." "Thank you," my father said, speaking with the eerie impersonality of a machine. "Thank you," he repeated. "Thank you." "Herman, please," my mother whispered, "let's just go." "Absolutely not. We're finishing our food." He cleared his throat to continue. "We're touring Washington by night. We are not going home till we tour Washington by night." The evening, in other words, was to be seen through to the end without our being frightened away. For Sandy and me that meant consuming big new dishes of ice cream delivered to our table by one of the countermen. It took a few minutes for the cafeteria to come alive again with the squeaking of chairs and the rattle of cutlery and the light tinkle of plates, if not yet the full dinner-time clamor. "Would you like more coffee?" my father said to my mother. "You heard the owner. He wants you to fill your cup." "No," she murmured, "no more." "And you, Mr. Taylor, coffee?" "Nope, I'm fine." "So," my father said to Mr. Taylor, stiffly, lamely, but beginning again to push back at everything awful that was surging in, "what kind of job did you do before this one, or have you always been a guide in Washington?" And it was here that we heard once again from the man who'd stepped up to inform us that, like Benedict Arnold before him, Walter Winchell had sold out to the British. "Oh, don't you worry," he was assuring his friends. "The Jews will find out soon enough." In all that quiet there was no mistaking what he'd said, especially as he hadn't bothered to modulate the taunt in any way. Half the diners didn't even look up, pretending to have heard nothing, but more than a few twisted round to look right at the offending objects. I'd seen tarring and feathering only once in a Western movie, but I thought, we were going to be tarred and feathered, envisioning our humiliation sticking to the skin like a coat of thick filth that you could never get off. My father was stalled for a moment, having to decide once again whether to attempt to control the event or to give in. "I was asking Mr. Taylor," he said suddenly to my mother, while taking her hands in both of his, "about what he did before being a guide." And he looked at her like someone casting a spell, someone whose art is to prevent your will from being free of his and keep you from acting on your own. "Yes," she said, "I heard." And then, her anguish once again filling her with tears, she nonetheless drew herself up, erect in her seat, and said to Mr. Taylor, please tell us." "Keep eating your ice cream, boys," my father said, reaching out and patting our forearms until we looked him right in the eye. "Is it good?" "Yes," we said. "Well, you just keep eating and take your time." He smiled to make us smile, and then said to Mr. Taylor, "The job before this one, your old job, what was it you did again?" "I was a college teacher, Mr. Roth." "Is that right?" my father said. "Hear that, boys? You're eating dinner with a college teacher." "College history teacher," added Mr. Taylor for the sake of accuracy. "Should have known," my father admitted. "Little college in northwest Indiana," Mr. Taylor told the four of us. "When they shut the place down in '32, that was it for me." "So what'd you do then?" my father asked. "Well, you can imagine, what with unemployment and all the strikes, I did a little of everything. Harvested mint up in the Indiana mucklands, packed meat for the slaughterhouse in Hammond, packed soap for Cuddy in East Chicago, worked a year for real silk hosiery mills in Indianapolis, even worked a stint in Logansport at the mental hospital there, working as an orderly for people suffering mental diseases. Hard times finally washed me up here." "And what was the name of the college where you taught?" my father asked. "Wabash." "Wabash. Well," said my father, soothed by the very sound of the word, "everybody has heard of that." 426 students? I'm not sure they have. What everybody has heard of is something that one of our distinguished graduates once said, though they don't necessarily know him for being a Wabash man. They know him for being U.S. Vice President from 1912 to 1920. That is our two-term Vice President, Thomas Riley Marshall. "Sure," my father said. "Vice President Marshall, the Democratic governor of Indiana. Vice President under another great Democrat, Woodrow Wilson. Man of dignity, President Wilson. It was President Wilson," he said, after 2 days' tutelage under Mr. Taylor himself, in the mood now to elucidate, "who had the courage to appoint Louis D. Brandeis to the Supreme Court, first Jewish member ever of the Supreme Court. You know that, boys?" We did. It was hardly the first time he'd told us.